Hello and welcome to another video here on my channel. My name is Ruben Ugarte and today we are talking about Funnel.io. This is one of my favorite tools and I want to show you exactly what it is, how I use it, and how you can get started over the next little while. I work with a lot of different organizations and help them figure out their data stack, right? What tools should they be using on the marketing side? What tools should they be using on the product side? And of course, you may have seen other videos in my channel for Mixpanel or Amplitude and so on. And Funnel.io, I think it can play a very crucial role in this stack. Now, without further ado, let's jump in and understand exactly what is Funnel.io. As in many of my videos, I just want to walk you through, share my screen. I think is the best way for you to understand what the tool is and how to use it. So here's the homepage for Funnel.io at the time of the recording. And Funnel is really a way to take data from many sources and then send them to a specific destination. This is very much an ETL of sorts, the extract, transform, and load. But Funnel has really focused in particular on the marketing individuals, marketing teams, and has built a product around that. So if you look at what the product is, and they call it this also a platform here. We'll see the very classic things you might expect. There is destinations, or there's sources, what they might call connectors. And in the connectors, you'll see very classic things: Facebook ads, Facebook pages, Google ads, TikTok ads. There's a lot of different ad platforms and social media platforms, really, for that matter, that are showing you here, just in the top of the list. And I find my experiences, they tend to have a lot of different marketing connectors for the most popular platforms, of course, but even some of the less popular, a little bit more obscure platforms. And that has been how they sort of focus their product. Now, you will find things like Mixpanel here, right? I don't know if they have Amplitude. Oh, they do have Amplitude, right? You might find things like WooCommerce for e-commerce, Shopify, and so on. But I find in my experience, they've done a really in-depth focus on the marketing sources, specifically ad platforms. And that has been the primary use case I have used Funnel for. So you have all these sources on the one side. Let's imagine that's on the left side. We want to pull from them, and then we're going to send the data to some destination. It could be Google Sheets. It could be Google BigQuery, a data warehouse of sorts, some kind of AWS data warehouse, and so on. The benefit here is that if you want to pull data from Facebook ads, for example, you could do this yourself, right? You could use the same API that Funnel is using. You can write some kind of logic in whatever language you like, and you can then send the data to some kind of destination, Google Sheets, BigQuery, whatever. But you can imagine that if you have to do this multiple times, let's say for Facebook ads, and then Google ads, and then TikTok ads, and then Apple search ads, now you're starting to sort of do the same work over and over again. You then have to figure out how to maintain these connections, right? These APIs may change, and you have to stay on top of that. You have to figure out how to deal with errors, any potential downtime, and so on. So Funnel basically takes care of that for you. You can know that if you connect with Facebook, the connection will remain. And if there's an error of some kind, I have seen a few of those myself. Typically, a reauthorization, a reconnection, re-entering your credentials is enough to then fix it and get it working. And I've used Funnel in certain projects for multiple years. You can talk about 3, 4, 5 years, pulling from the same sources, pulling the same dimensions and metrics with very little downtime. This is one of my sort of go-to products for the specific use case we're going to see here a little bit later, just because it's just so reliable, right? I know that if I connect with Facebook, if I connect to Google Ads and a bunch of other sources, the data will be there every day, refresh, the numbers will be accurate, and any kind of issues and so on are typically handled very well by Funnel in the background with, again, the very minimal interaction on my end. If I can count on my hand, it might be once a year perhaps where something breaks and I need to reauthorize it, but it's very quick, it's very fast. Now let's look at some of the destinations here. Again, just what we might expect, very classic things. Google Sheets, I use this a lot. I use Google BigQuery a lot as well, but you have a few other things. Primarily, they are some kind of data storage option, right? A data warehouse, maybe SFTP here if you want to send it to your own server. Some specific databases here like Postgres or Azure or MySQL, and Airtable, the SQL here. That's it. So you're not really sending this to, let's say, a Mixpanel or Amplitude. So Funnel is not really a competitor to Segment.com or RudderStack, CDP platforms. They have really focused on this more specific niche, marketing data, and then sending it to a place where then the data will then be analyzed or visualized. In my case, for example, it's very common to send it to Google Sheets if we're not talking about a lot of data, or send it to Google BigQuery if we're talking about more data, and then visualize it with something like Looker Studio or Tableau or some other kind of BI tool. So where the data is kind of remains in its original structure, more or less, it's tweaked and modeled a little bit, but it's really from point A to point B. And I've done videos on my channel for Segment.com, and you can see the differences with something like this. So our destinations are generally pretty straightforward, with some exceptions. We see some Google Analytics data here, for example. This is typically for conversions. But generally, we're talking about some database of sorts. I mean, even Google Sheets can be seen as a very sort of lightweight database, right? Now going back here, there's a few things about reporting we can do within Funnel. I'll show you those in a second, what those look like. It tends to be pretty basic, but basic might be just enough. And I'll show you actually a couple of ways I do reporting myself, which is the extent of it. Okay, so let's jump into pricing before we go on. Now, Funnel charges by this idea of flex points. I don't find the pricing intuitive. You get a certain number of flex points. For example, right, the starter plan has 400 flex points. You get access to the core connectors, and then there's business connectors, which tend to be more advanced, and there's enterprise connectors and so on. This division between connector types is common. We might see Facebook ads, Google ads being standard, Google Analytics and so on. Then we might see something a little bit more advanced being business. I think we saw Amplitude in this location here. We have the same thing for destinations, Google Sheets being a very core destination, but Google BigQuery being a business one. And then, of course, we have enterprise tools like Adobe Analytics and so on that tend to be more on the enterprise level, and this will be Snowflake. Now, the flex points, again, doesn't really feel as intuitive compared to just regular pricing, but luckily, Funnel does provide a calculator here. So we can actually see something like this here. So we can say, let's say we want Facebook ads, Google ads, Google Analytics, which are all starter, right? And you can see that having 3 starters would fit within the starter plan. And if we had Google Sheets, which we also starter, we still be within that sort of free plan here. And we're not quite over yet. However, if we then add, let's say, maybe Apple Search is actually starter. Let's add Amplitude, which we know is business. Now we have a billing price per month. And then if we were to add BigQuery, now that gets to add, and we get a bit of an estimate here. It's not being done on rows or amount of data you're pulling in. It's just done on the type of connectors and maybe other specific features you might want. Some of the special add-ons, right? Single sign-on add-on. Trying to choose your data region of choice. Maybe you want to store your data in the European Union, for example. And there's a few other features here, which I'll show you some of them in a second. But you tend to find that the core product is available on those core starter points, and some of the features that get added later on tend to make sense if you're looking for them. For example, if you're a large organization and you tend to have very specific enterprise requirements around single sign-on, where the data gets stored, audit logs, and things like that, you'll be there. Otherwise, I find the starter plan is a great place to start if you have pretty standard needs, Facebook ads, Google ads, Google Analytics. Generally, I find myself in the business plan quite often, in the middle plan, as there's at least a couple things, a couple connectors or destinations that I need that are not on a starter basis. Google BigQuery being a good example of that. I use that a lot, and it's typically not a starter one. So the best way to understand the pricing is honestly just to plug things into the calculator, what specific data sources you need, which ones are perhaps a nice to have and then can be added later, and then see what is the quote that you get. And of course, you can always ramp up to it. You might have very standard needs of Facebook ads and Google ads, and you can start with Google Sheets. It's good enough. And then eventually you can just transform that to something a little bit more reliable by swapping out Google Sheets for Google BigQuery and adding a couple other connectors that may not be of the starter package. Again, the flex points themselves don't quite make sense to me intuitively, so I always need to sort of run the calculator myself. All right, so let's jump into the product and let's see what the product looks like and show you some of the main functionality here. So we are in the home page, and you get just a quick overview as to what's going on, some quick actions. I would say I find the funnel product to be simple, and I mean that in a positive way. The things that you're doing here to pull data out, data sources, you then might want to transform it in some ways. I'll show you a little bit about that, but maybe the organize here, dimensions, metrics, and then sending this data somewhere through a share. They tend to be very easy and straightforward to use. And I think the simplicity is great because, again, over time and over multiple years, I come to rely on the product being consistently good and not over adding too much complexity. And I think the team has done a good job of that. So let's start with data sources. So I have here two data sources. We have Google Ads and we have Facebook Ads. Again, standard starter sources we saw from the pricing page below. What we do when we connect a data source, right? We get all the options. For example, if we're going to connect another data source, another Google Ads source, we come here and it'll guides you through typically about 4 steps to get this data source connected. It varies from data source to data source. Google Ads, for example, requires you to enter a Google account. You can see I have an existing account here. So you would enter your credentials of the Google account that contains access to Google Ads, and then you get access to it. Then you would see what accounts are in the Google Ads account. You would configure the data source itself, and then you confirm and connect. Let me show you a little bit here what that might look like. So we authenticate it, then we can see the list of accounts that are available to us under this Google account, right? We would choose one, whatever the account is that's relevant, or perhaps multiple accounts. And then we get a chance to configure the data source. Generally, the default configuration is good enough, right? And you can see some of the details here. It's telling you that this is going to give you a campaign level overview with the most common metrics and dimensions, cost, click, impression, and so on. Again, if you're not sure, I will leave this as default. And then you can see if you're actually missing anything, but generally this is pretty good. However, there is a way to add a customized template of what data you pull. You can see this is a premium option. Some examples here is, for example, there might be specific metrics, maybe a breakdown that's not available here. This is campaign level. You may want the data at a ad set or ad level, if we're talking about Google Ads here. And you may want some metrics and I may not want others. So you can choose that by having a template and having the level of configuration when you pull from the data source. We'll keep the default configuration. We can go at the end. And again, now it just tells us that your data source configured and ready to be connected. That's it, right? I won't do this as well. This is actually a real account. We'll go back. And you will have your data source here, right? And now you can see that whatever date range is available, it will tell you the data here. In this case, this data only comes from about late March 2022 to today, 2024. Funnel will then figure out the best way to refresh this data. Typically, a lot of this data is available in different increments and intervals. You need to check the documentation for each data source. In my experience, I typically refresh the data in the destination, not at the connector level, every 24 hours. I find that 24-hour window is good enough, especially when we're dealing with data like ad platforms and so on. We may not necessarily want the latest data up to the last minute. We may actually want to give the data a 24-hour window to settle and finish any attributions that might be needed. Nonetheless, you do have a few options when it comes to it. So if you want to have more frequent data, it is a possibility. And Funnel, again, typically does this very well. The status is okay. If there's every issue, it will tell you. Again, it doesn't happen very frequently. I think that's just how well built this data source connectors are, right? And I've had accounts with 8-9 connectors where the entire 8-9 connectors can work consistently for multiple years once you do the initial setup. If you ever want to change anything that we did, there is possible to edit the configuration. If you remember that specific option around what things you're bringing in, I have done this to change the configuration, and then Funnel would then go in and get all the historical data in that new configuration. So that is an option. And you see there's a couple other things, like you may want to pause the import, maybe you don't want to use this data in Funnel and so on. There is a couple of things here in the data source that is worth pointing out. We, of course, want to use this existing data connectors like Facebook Ads, Google Analytics, but there is very basic things here. For example, we can actually do some kind of file import, bring in a CSV, for example, maybe a webhook, maybe email import, there's Google Sheets. So there's actually lots of different ways to get your data into Funnel here. Yeah, a file import may be manual, a one-time thing that you may want to do. There is ways, of course, to get data out of systems that may not have an API, but perhaps you can get the system to output some kind of file and send it to an email on some kind of frequency and then get it. So lots of different variations to get data into Funnel besides the standard Google Ads and so on. And you can see there's lots of different things. If we look at Salesforce, for example, right, there's breakdowns here for Salesforce, different parts of the product, right, like opportunities or leads and so on, and on and on and on, right? There's a lot of connectors here. I'm not sure what the total number is at this point in time. I would say over 100, with a big focus on the marketing needs of a regular marketing team. Okay, once we have the data, then we can play around with it. Now, they have this tool here called the Data Explorer, which I find is really helpful, right? I'll use this very often to play around with the data. So, give you an example here. Once we have our data sources, we can look for all the data sources, or maybe we want just a specific data source, right? In our case, we only have two. We're gonna look at all data sources, and then we can choose fields. And here's where we get all the data from Facebook and Google, and we can see what this data looks like if we do just this, for example. Perfect. So we have several fields here. If you look at just Facebook ads, right, we're going to get a lot of different things. There's fields for conversions and engagement, performance, and so on. You'll find clicks, you'll find spend. I don't typically browse through this list by scrolling. I'm always simply searching through it, right? So if I go find something like clicks, right, we'll see that we have a few things, right? Here's clicks from Google Ads, and here's clicks all from Facebook ads, right? So if we add those two, we're going to remove this one for now, and we add date as a dimension, we can then load the data, and now we can see what is the last 30 days of data, looking at the clicks from Google Ads and Facebook ads, right? And we can keep filtering down. We can go at maybe campaign name. We have it for both. We may want to do it by something else and keep breaking it down. This is, I find, actually very helpful. A lot of times when I'm working with marketing teams, we need to double check discrepancies. And even though I work with some of these ad platforms regularly, I still find their interface sometimes a little bit tricky to use, if I'm honest. Facebook might change things, or Google Ads might change where things are. I find it easier to actually pull numbers directly from Funnel because I know it's pulling directly from the ad platforms. So if I see a number here, like for example, if I see 422 clicks in Google Ads for August the 5th, I know that's going to be the number that's coming directly from Google Ads, right? There's no transformation taking place. It's just being based on the source data. We may need to double check time zones, but generally this number is pretty accurate. So I have found myself often when I need to run queries, when I need to see what campaigns are showing in terms of conversions, engagement, cost, and things like that, to just actually quickly build a query here, because that's we're really just building this query by just adding things to the right either metrics or dimensions, running the data, and then we can see it here. Once you have data here, there's a couple of things you can do. You can save it as a view. So if you have a very specific view, imagine you're showing campaign breakdown daily over the last 30 days with all your key metrics, clicks, spend, conversions, return on investment, and so on. You can save this as a view. So then you just load the view, and this becomes almost like it's a saved chart, right? A saved table would be a better word here. You can also export it. So export to CSV or Google Sheets. Also very helpful, right? I may want this data, but I need to do some basic manipulations to it. So I'm just going to export it to CSV. So the Data Explorer is really fantastic. I find myself using this quite a bit as a way to go across all the data sources, quickly pull something out across all of them, and then see it. Now, there's a few things you'll see here that are special. like date, you may see that some of these metrics have the logo for the data source, for example, the Google Ads logo or the Facebook Ads logo, and some of them have this other logo here, which I'm not sure what that looks like. I guess it's just an actual logo for it. But if you add something like traffic source, you'll see this is a custom logo here. I want to show you what this means. So if we go to dimensions, what Funnel has done, it has brought in all the dimensions in this case. And dimensions are typically strings of some kind. For example, the name of the campaign is a dimension. Versus metrics are typically numbers or integers. So costs or impressions or clicks would be metrics. So when Funnel imports the data, it's familiar with the structure and it does a few things to normalize it so you can actually look at across the board. So take, for example, the ad set, and it'll store it under this ad set. So this captures the ad set name across all data sources, or for example, the campaign name across all data sources. The media type, it will do some logic here, so it will segment data into either direct, search, affiliate, social. This particularly relies on Google Ads. It will make a label to note if this data is paid or organic. So all the data from Facebook ads will be labeled as paid. All the data from, let's say, Facebook pages will be labeled as organic. And for traffic source, it will just simply label it and say, this data belongs to Facebook, this data belongs to Google. You can see here, there's some imported things here, right? The things that's important from Facebook ads and Google ads, and it'll give you a quick one-liner of what this says. Again, this is really helpful, right? If you're working with the APIs directly, you would then need to have the documentation open directly. This gives you a central place to tell you what's being brought in and what does it mean. And if you look at built-in, it has also added a few other things. Maybe the data source itself, the name of the data source, the date. So it has sort of cleaned up the data into a single date format. Then from there, it kind of figures out day of the week, month, number, week number, and so on. So it's kind of doing some manipulations for you here out of the box, which is really, really helpful. If you go to metrics, we're going to see the same thing. In this case, there's some custom metrics I created, and I can show you what those are. But there's a couple of things that Funnel already had. For example, CPC, CPM, CTR, it already had those. The cost per click, click-through rate, impressions, cost. And again, for example, for cost, typically they're labeled differently in each data source. So Facebook might call it spend, Google Ads might call it cost, but then Funnel will create this custom metric that can then take all of them and simply put them under one. So if we go back to our data explorer and we want to, we could add, for example, cost in Google Ads, but then Facebook Ads might call it differently and it's a whole different column. Instead, we can just add cost here. And by adding cost here, it's able to get the cost across all data platforms. And the same thing will be for impressions and clicks and anything else, right? And these are all the things that Funnel is doing for you out of the box. So this is very, very helpful when you're trying to combine data from multiple data sources into one thing. You don't necessarily have to do a lot of these things manually. Now, in other cases where you're dealing with perhaps conversions that are specific to you, you can actually then replicate the same idea and create something that is universal. So a good example here would be, let's say, trials here. So this is a custom metric that we have with these two accounts. And you can see here that what we end up doing here is creating some logic. So we simply say, hey, for Facebook ads, when the traffic source is Facebook and within this specific dates, take the value of the trial started metric. Otherwise, do some other logic here and otherwise do that. And then from Google Ads, we're going to go find something similar. We're going to find this event called sign up started. And then we may have another event called trial started and so on and so on. And now we combine all of those conversions under a single thing called trials. And if we ever have other data sources, we'll just keep adding them for each data source. So now we can take all the trials across all the data sources into a single metric. So when we export the two, we don't have to export 8 different conversion events each, for each data source. In this case, we wouldn't have to export 2 conversion events. We wouldn't have to export trial started for Facebook and trial started for Google Ads. We could just export one column called trials, which is going to take both of them. And then in the export itself, when we export this data out to Google Sheets or BigQuery, it's going to be broken down by each traffic source, and you'll see how that happens in a second. So this is very, very helpful, right? And what's cool too is, I sometimes run into cases where we have issues in the tracking at Facebook or Google Ads or whatever. and we need to do some manual tweaks to the data, right? So we may have to say, hey, between this 2-week period, we have some tracking errors, or we're going to do an estimate of what the trial should have been. We can do the quick formula here. We change it at this custom level, and we can apply it to all the exports. So it just becomes a very handy way and a central way to handle any issues, any custom formulas, anything like that. So you can see here that I've done this for a few things like signups, trials, this conversion code TT, checkout started, cost per checkout started, and so on. So it's just a very handy way to create our own metrics that can apply to multiple data sources. And when you have two, in this case, you may see, maybe that's not a lot of work. You're only dealing with two things, but you want to think about the future. And a future where you may not only have two data sources, you may have 8 different channels, all running different ads and campaigns, driving towards the same conversions, purchases, signups, trials. And instead of having to then have more and more columns grow in our export, we can have one single column for each of those conversions, trials, signups, purchases, and so on, and simply do the logic on our end. So very, very helpful. Again, just another way in which it becomes really easy to break this down. Now, whenever we export data, we can just simply keep adding dimensions to do it. So if you see in this case, we're breaking down the data by date, and we get clicks for Google Ads, clicks for Facebook Ads, and cost. Let's actually swap out clicks for the universal version. So it'll be a little bit better here. It'll make a little more sense. And let's also take impressions, the universal version. So that's the same thing. So now we get to see costs on a daily basis across both data sources, Google Ads and Facebook Ads. The same for clicks, the same for impressions. Now let's say we want to break it down by each data source, because that's probably more helpful in this case. We can then go find a custom dimension called traffic source, add that, and now we'll break it for us. So now we can see exactly what's being spent for Facebook, how many clicks it got, what impression it got, same for Google, and so on, right? And we can keep doing this breakdown as needed. We can add campaign names, ad set names, ad names if we have the level of configuration, and so on. So this is a way for us to normalize the data in a way, where the transformations we're making here are not that complex, where it's really more about logic to combine things into a single universal metric or universal dimension. But nonetheless, it just makes working with the data a little bit easier. And again, because the connections with the data sources are so reliable and so consistent, we know that we can do this work once and it's going to really sustain itself for multiple years. Honestly, things like this, which seem small, when you add them up and in the aggregate, they can take a lot of time and a lot of issues to be able to maintain them and clean them and keep them sustainable. And Funnel just makes it really easy. I know that I can do this logic for trials once, and generally it's going to stick around as needed. Quick break from our Funnel.io video here. If you're looking for help implementing tools like Funnel.io and really just a broader tech stack for your data, for your marketing team, for your product team, get in touch. I work with over 80 organizations doing this. I understand different industries, different teams, and I can really help you do this much faster than you might even imagine. Right? So check out a link in the description below that's called rubenugarte.com/analytics. And in the link, you'll see all the details you might want around how to possibly this can help your team, including pricing, what it looks like, what's needed, the general process, testimonials, and anything else. I typically save organizations, 30, 50 hours of engineering time, some of the most precious time typically within companies. Thousands of dollars, often $25,000 or more, especially when you start to look at what you may be paying tools on an annual basis and multiple years. Being able to avoid the wrong tool and wasting time, especially engineering time, it's really, really important. So you can see in that link, rubenugarte.com/analytics, how that may work for you. With that being said, let's go back to the video. So we have this data explorer, basically a table that allows us to really build out queries really quick, get numbers, get answers, and then take this data out. Let's see how we can look at this in a couple of ways. Before we move on, let's look at dashboards. So Funnel.io did build a dashboard service here. I typically don't use this very much. You can see it's only available in some subscriptions, right? And it's based on the number of flex points. Again, how the flex points are used, not quite sure. But dashboards allow you to take the metrics we just saw and then create simple charts. From other accounts I have access to, there might be about 5 or 6 different charts, bar charts, line charts, and so on. And you're using the same sort of dimensions and metrics to build out those charts and have a date range. Again, I don't use this myself on a regular basis. I find I typically build dashboards elsewhere, like Looker Data Studio or Tableau or something else, just because there's a little bit more flexibility. You know, if I think about Looker Data Studio, that tool, which is free, has maybe 25 different charts, right? And it has all these different ways of filtering data and blending data. And of course, we're combining data not just from Google BigQuery, but we may bring data from somewhere else, like Google Analytics or a bunch of other tools that may not be supported in Funnel. So typically, that's where I build my dashboards, and I think that's why I typically have not used this feature myself. However, if you want perhaps a simple dashboard that's looking at just the Funnel.io data, just your marketing data, and you want to build something that's quick, this will be a great spot to do it, right? We saw how quick it was to build the table here in the Data Explorer. You can really expect a very similar process to build charts. You know, right now we're just building tables. We could easily take this table, for example, and show this 3 metrics broken down by channel over the last 30 days. It would probably just take a few more clicks. So in terms of difficulty to build dashboards, this will be a very easy way to do it. It just may not be the most comprehensive way, depending on what data sources and what data you're using and what you may want to do with those dashboards, right? How you may want to share them or let other people access them. But it's an option nonetheless. Now, what I do use a lot is the data shares. Typically, once I brought the data in, which is a big win, right? We can do that consistently and reliably. And I made some tweaks to the dimensions and metrics. So I combine things beyond the defaults, like creating this custom universal conversions like trials and signups. I can then export the data. It has been brought in, it's been cleaned or normalized, combined, and now I can send it somewhere. Now this is just a Google Sheets, right? As a data share, very basic. This account doesn't have that much data, so Google Sheets is a good fit. But whenever we have any more data and the Google Sheets might start to run a little bit slow, we can do a few other things. Now, just like before, right, we saw that some of the data destinations are under the business plan or the premium plan, and we only have access to the basic ones. But just like before, you know, if we were to do, let's say, another Google Sheets, we would give it a name, we would do some kind of authentication. In this case, it's a Google account, and then you choose the spreadsheet name or you give it a name. You have some options on the title, where you want the data to start, you know, what column, what row. And then you get to choose the data. So just like before, you might want to have a view you already created, or you basically use the same idea as before, right? The same selector here, and you go and you say, okay, now I want clicks. Actually, we already have clicks here. Maybe I want my custom thing called trials, and you add it. And this is just then creating a combination of rows and columns, right? And if you go back to the Data Explorer we were looking at before, it's effectively that. So whatever you see in the Data Explorer with all your selected dimensions and metrics, you would then see that in Google Sheets, or you would then see that in BigQuery or wherever you're sending it. And of course, depending on what the destination kind of stores the data as. You may have some filters here. So you may want all this data, but you may only want, for example, a very specific data source, right? You may only want the Facebook data source or something like that. You may only want a specific metric. And you have a couple of things to maybe limit rows, change currencies if you need be. Then you have data ranges here. Typically, I use dynamic data ranges or rolling data ranges. So I might say, you know, give me all the data from January 1st. Let's go here to today. And then because this data share is going to be continuous, you'll see, for example, I can set this to repeat every day. It's simply going to just keep updating, right? So it's going to take all the data from January 1st to today. That will be to September 2nd today, but tomorrow will be to September 3rd, the day after September 4th, and so on. So we always have the latest data. Now this is different from this one, right? In this case, Funnel.io would then just take the last 3 months, and then it will overwrite all the existing data and give you the last 3 months. So whatever it's in this data destination, let's say it's Google Sheets, it will always just be the last 3 months. So eventually some of the historical data disappears. That may be ideal for your use case. You determine what that looks like. Like I say, in typically my part, I'm pulling a longer data range. You know, I might always be interested in the last 12 months, last 18 months, or maybe going from a specific start date like January 1st to today, and the data is just growing more and more as it goes on. We have some storing tools, pretty simple, right? We have the header format. We're going to take the field name, and then the recurrence is what I'm going to show you. So in the data destination, we have this daily or weekly export. We choose the date. and which is the time zone of when this went, and some notes, right? And if there's any error with the job failing, we can get some notifications. Again, I have run some of this data shares for multiple years on a daily basis. I don't remember when this has failed even once, if I'm honest. It's just a very reliable process to take data out, even to a Google Sheets. And of course, if you could take it to something like Google BigQuery, likely even more reliable as you don't have to worry about how big the Google Sheets might get. But Google Sheets is a very easy way to get started. It's a very easy way to start to get data out in a way that's easy to use. Looker Data Studio is here. I actually haven't used this myself. I think I prefer to go to Google Sheets and then to Looker Studio, but this is an option nonetheless that you can use. And once you have it, you can see the status, when it ran last, you can turn it off, you can tweak it, you can run it manually. So in some cases, for example, I might make some changes to the underlying data. So I might tweak, for example, that trials conversion you saw before, and I don't want to wait until the next scheduled run, which might be tomorrow. So I'll just run it manually, and I'll get the latest data in. So again, just a really handy way, right? If you think about this just simple process here, it means that if I'm pulling the last 18 months worth of data, and then I make a change to how a conversion is handled, like trials, and that change affects 15 months of historical data, I can make the change in a few minutes here in Funnel by changing this universal conversion. And then I can just rerun the share over those 18 months, and all the historical data will get updated in effectively a few minutes. There's no need to go in and manually change rows or go in and change the Google BigQuery storage or do something else. It becomes a very, very handy way to make drastic changes to historical data, because we're dealing with sort of single sources of truth, right? We build this universal metrics or these universal dimensions, and from there we can make changes that apply to all the data. So again, it's just really powerful. If you've done any kind of work with this data, with this type of data, which the data itself is not complex, but some of these things can become very exhausting. And I've done it the other way. So I know what it's like when you have to try to modify thousands of rows because some minor tweak was done to how currencies are handled or how the value of conversion should be calculated. And Funnel just makes it really, really easy to do that and get the latest data and then visualize it wherever you are. Now that's everything about the product. The other thing you might notice here is the product is simple, right? There's a handful of functions, but they all work really well, right? And it works really well to pull in the data. It works really well to do some modifications and tweaks to the data. It works really well to then export it somewhere. And I think that's what the product just simply gets right. That if this use case is for you, if you're a marketing team in particular, if all your data sources are here, at least the ones you care about, and you need to modify the data and send it to the specific destination, just a fantastic product to do that, if I'm honest. Now, before we go on, I do want to show you some alternatives because Funnel.io is not the only player in this space, and I want you to have at least a few other options you can consider and think about. So what I always tell companies when we're looking at tools like Funnel.io is there's always lots of options. It's not the only option. I would most likely, top of my head, know at least 3 or 5 other ones, and there might be honestly another 20, 30 or 40, maybe even more that are out there once we start digging deeper. So there's always options, right? So you can look at them, and I think in other videos I've talked about how to compare tools, but you can look at different functionality and pricing and things like that. Maybe there's some things you didn't see in the Funnel.io product that you might be curious about. So let me show you some of the options that come to mind for me when I think about alternatives to Funnel.io. First, we have Supermetrics. They've been around for a long time, and they build themselves around a very similar niche where they really want to go after marketing teams and their marketing sources. And you can see the same idea, right? A source of truth. We pull it from different sources like Facebook ads and Google ads, and then we're going to send it somewhere like a spreadsheet or Looker or some kind of data warehouse and so on. I won't go through the entire tool in detail. I just want to show you what this looks like. They typically have add-ons for Google Sheets, which I've used in the past. They have an add-on for Excel, which I used in the past as well. And they kind of let you do very similar things, right? So just one option. You can see very similar concepts and you can compare pricing and what it looks like. Then you have Improvallo here. And again, very similar idea, right? You're taking your marketing data. You can see it's a very specific focus. There's connectors, data sources. You can send to a data warehouse. You can extract it. You can modify it. You can tweak it. I think Improviso also has some intelligence. There might be adding some AI here to give you some answers. So perhaps not only build those simple queries you saw before with Funnel.io, but maybe do something more with them. But again, just very, very similar process where you need to take multiple data sources, normalize it, join it, make it all talk sort of the same language. You use the same concepts when you talk about clicks and impressions and so on, and then send it somewhere. And third, that will be Adverity. I haven't worked with Improviso myself, just want to make a note of that, and I haven't worked with Adverity myself. But this is the ones that seem to come to mind when I talk to teams and they were looking for this kind of tool and they were doing the names that we considered before choosing something like Funnel.io. So just like before, right? We have a platform, we have some Connect data, we manage it, we share it. So 3 tools. Take these tools, plug them into Google. You're gonna get 5 other options, and from there you make some choices. I wouldn't complicate myself too much. I would just make a list of the 5 or 10 key features you need, then go to the website, rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, or perhaps you talk to sales reps, you look at pricing, and you make a choice, right? I just want to give you the tool I use myself quite a bit in terms of funnel, but there's lots of different tools out there that can help you get there. Now, that is all I have for today. This is an overview of what you need to get started with Funnel.io, try to give you a general sense of how you can get going, really in less than an hour, right? This video is no longer than that. And you can see how simple the tool is and how powerful it can be as you build it over time and start to work with it. It's one of my favorite tools, and I wanted to show you that. And of course, show you some of the alternatives that you can explore that use a similar functionality and that may be a better fit for your organization. Now, a few things before you go. If you're looking for help to set up tools like this, not just Funnel, of course, which is relatively straightforward, but if you really want to set up a more comprehensive data stack, check out the link in my description, rubenugarte.com/analytics. I can show you how I've done this with other companies, how it works, prices, testimonials, FAQs. That's all there on one page. And you can see if this is something that's relevant to your team and can help you accelerate how your team uses data and then extracts insights from that data. Second, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, add a comment below. Let me know what you thought about the video. Let me know if you have any questions that perhaps you didn't see me answer that you're curious about. I'll do my best to answer as best as I can, but you can put that in the comments below. And of course, share the video with your team if you think it might also help them understand this specific tool. That being said, my name is Ruben Ugarte. Until next time, we'll talk soon.